We've got another 4 world-renowned experts in their fields for this next really interesting session. They're going to give us perspectives on what resilience and future-proof actually means for the people at the coalface, for the designers, the contractors and the planners, and the influence that that has on their respective inputs into the realisation of buildings and infrastructure projects. So as you can see, my 4 gentlemen are up on the stage already. We have Keith Clark from Forum for the Future, Noel Morin from Scanksa, David Glover from AECOM, and also Ken Shuttleworth from Make Architects. So my thanks to them. I'm going to turn to Keith Clark first. Keith Clark is chairman of Forum for the Future and an independent advisor. Before that, he was chief executive of Atkins, the largest engineering and design consultancy in the country, during which time he was the forefront of encouraging the built environment sector to embrace carbon critical thinking, of course, in response to climate change. Please give Keith Clark a warm welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to shamelessly plug the Institute of Civil Engineers State of the Nation report, which was launched yesterday, and you'll see it covered in the Telegraph, the FT, the Guardian, and the Independent this morning, because it talks about resilience of infrastructure and the role of infrastructure. And that, and its relationship to cities, is complete in that most people are going to live in cities. Now, just talking about resilience, the most resilient issue is actually a diverse economy. Without a diverse economy, cities simply cannot be resilient, either through design or employment or equality or anything else. And that's been proven if you look at New York, survived 2 major disasters, 9/11, the odd hurricane, and it's resilient because it's wealthy. Other places are not resilient because they're poor. Now, if you look forward with resilience and what it means to design, there is a stark choice. Are we designing for a 2-degree world? Or are we designing for a 3 to 4 degree world? At 4 degrees, most scenarios say it's not worth bothering because only the richest can afford to erect the immigration controls to keep other people out. And that's where 4 degrees takes you, as well as a range of other things. So implicit in actually looking for a resilient 2-degree world, which is where we're going, and I'm using shorthand for that, is the fact that we'll be adapting our cities to a different type of extreme weather event, more extreme and more frequent. And the Met Office with Newcastle, stunning work on that. And that's the reality. We are now going to be designing for a different type of climate profile for all cities in the world. And they are going to be more violent in their extremes. One of the problems with that, though, is we could be digging a bigger carbon hole by the rich and the wealthy cities adapting by more air conditioning, adapting by air conditioning the subways to a greater degree, adapting by actually buying water from other places, which they don't have themselves. That's already happening in California, happening in a whole range of places, and water will become scarce. We already do use desalination in the Thames Valley. We laugh about the Middle East, people living in the desert and not having water, and we desal in London. Somewhat absurd. And going forward, that's going to be, again, the role of the privilege. Now, applying that to cities and city designers, city fabric has 2 parts. It has infrastructure and public space, and it has buildings, very crudely. Buildings actually need to be far more efficient. They need to use less resources. They need to emit less heat. They need to actually counter the effect of heat islands. And that's what designers are about. It's not about flexibility, because buildings are flexible. And most buildings built for flexibility get marooned in isolation and never changed. If you look at the number of buildings designed to be ultimately flexible, they've never changed, whereas everything else has been adapted. Whereas public space, the bits between the buildings, including the way you use transit systems, the way you use sidewalks, the priorities at intersections, needs to be ambiguous. It needs to adapt to different social groups behaving in different social ways with different types of economy, different types of modal split, different types of information technology. And that is a real challenge, actually, not to let too many architects design public space, because they tend to be a bit specific. And there's all sorts of examples there. You can look at Chiswick Park, some great architecture, but the landscape is pure art. It never moves in the last 15 years. It doesn't evolve. You look at good city streetscapes, the way we use squares, the way we use streets changes. You move the curb. And that's one of the great resiliences. But allowing people the dignity to travel to a variety of jobs within a city safely, with dignity, with a sense of arrival, with a sense of journey, is the role of the public space. The role of the buildings is to give you objects that work really well, maybe look nice, maybe don't look nice, but actually are incredibly efficient. A real conundrum to go forward. But are you doing it with more carbon intensity? Are you doing it with the 80% mitigation of carbon that we have by law in the UK? And actually, if you look what Obama's doing with 30% cutting greenhouse gases in power supply, that's his way of adapting to it. And there's about 126 countries with actually decarbonising legislation of one sort or another that affects the urban fabric are actually in place now. And how many of the design community, the design, the construction, the suppliers, the material suppliers, have actually engaged in that trend? And the trend is an accelerating one. Interestingly, I'd say the built environment is probably 5 years behind the automotive and probably 10 years behind aerospace, where people have bet their companies on new technology. The Dreamliner, the A380, the new electric cars, the iterations of new electric cars. The BMW i3, completely different from the old hybrids that I drive. And there's going to be a real acceleration of that. And have we done that with the built environment? Do we have buildings which are using 1/10 of the input they were before, while still allowing a decent and flexible workspace that other people can come and do different things in? I don't think we have. So there's a real role to actually start to play with the way we look at our built environment, not to expect cities to be solved instantly, but to look at incremental and coordinated changes. And one of the drivers for that is to change standards. As an industry, we usually watch standards being developed over the years and then complain that we don't like the way they're applied. To be creative as an industry, we actually need to be people that develop standards and apply them on a time frame and cycle that instead of being 5 to 10 years is in 18 months. If the phone industry developed phones on a cycle time the way we do standards for buildings, you wouldn't have an iPhone. You'd have a tin can with a string, because that would be the rate of progress you'd have been locked into. So it's a very interesting dynamic. We are on the cusp of some real changes in the way we run cities. The data is there, the information and ability to move it is there. All those apps are coming. So it's not a problem of technology. It's a problem of values and the way we govern and the way we have an interplay between public space, private space, transportation systems, and the economy. A phenomenal challenge, and one actually which things like BASE need to encourage. But we are locked into a choice. Do we dig a bigger carbon hole and hope that the 500,000 people crossing the Mediterranean now won't turn into 11 million or 100 million? Or do we actually look to radically change our carbon profile of the built environment? And it's not somebody else. It is everything. It's the power supply. It's the way we have a circular economy, which again, State of the Nation says, we've done our bit with recycling. The next step, effectively in the UK, is to go to a circular economy. So we should be designing in the way we reuse things rather than just putting it in different bins when you finish at the end of the house. So an interesting one. It's the right time to actually do things differently. And as one environmental minister said, he got actually fired and put in jail, but Chris Hume actually said to the CBI Climate Change Committee, in 10 years, half of you people will be bankrupt, because that's what industrial revolutions do, and climate change is actually an industrial revolution, and its cities are fundamental to that. Thank you.
Well, Keith, thank you so much. I'm going to invite Noel up next to speak. Noel is Senior Vice President of SCANCSA. of course, one of our sponsors. He's had management roles at ICI, he's been at the RMC Group, and he's now Senior Vice President for Sustainability, a job he's had for nearly 10 years. 10 years, thank you.
Thank you. I'm based in Sweden. I'm in the corporate head office. It's not Skanska UK. So I'm going to give you an international perspective on this, and I've got some slides. I want to try and cover the context, quickly go through some of the key environmental issues as we see them, some of the social issues, and take an example. And these are all outside the UK. The context is pretty obvious. We've got an awful lot of building still ahead of us, and as Keith said, we need to do it differently. So what are we going to do about it? Are we going to adopt a sticking plaster strategy for cities like London, or something different? And clearly it has to be different. So we need smarter cities. And I want to take some examples of that from places outside of this country that have long-term vision, planning, strategy, and it goes without saying, leadership, political and otherwise, and the whole issue of who pays for it. Now, I'm going to lean quite heavily on a piece of work that we think is very interesting. This was a report that was published by Grosvenor recently. They introduced it by saying they've been investing in property for 300 years. We're only 125 years old, so we feel quite immature. But it looks at 50 cities around the world, and it just so happens that on this, it looks at two dimensions. One is the vulnerability of 50 cities, and on the other axis, it looks at their capacity to adapt. Now, interestingly, in terms of vulnerability, Stockholm, where I'm based and where Skanska is based, sits alongside London. We're 14th and 15th on that league table. When it comes to adaptive capacity to change, Stockholm goes up to 7th and London drops way down. I'm also going to touch on Seattle, which is very low down the list in terms of vulnerability, but has an adaptive capacity somewhere in the middle. And I think it's really interesting. If you haven't seen this report, I recommend you have a look at it, because it's something that's excited us quite a lot. Why? We've been involved with a number of other organizations in Stockholm recently in putting to the city a vision for Stockholm for 2070. And this isn't about cars flying through the streets as we saw in the 1960s vision for the year 2000. This is about new communities, how they get connected, what are the social consequences. Infrastructure, for example, tunnels that carry trains, but they also double up as highways. Toll roads for the highways that pay for the trains. So you get public infrastructure for free by taxing automobiles, probably electric by then. And so it goes. Now, have we got a 2070 strategy for London? Have we got a vision for London? How many other cities work like this? We've come up with some tools, and I want to concentrate mostly on the how. How are we going to do this? Because we all know what the what looks like. It's a big challenge. We've got some tools. Future-proof is part of our language too. It's up on the top right-hand corner. We've been talking about this and doing it for the last 4 years, and we've come up with some KPIs that are essential. This is a building version. I could also talk about a civil infrastructure version as well. We run our business like this today. We work with our suppliers like this. We work with our partners like this in all the markets where we do business. This is how we do it. And this is how cities like London need to do it. The cost question is, there's a lot of urban myth around the cost of being green, of building high-performance green buildings. There's a lot of research that was published last year by the World Business Council, not the World Green Building Council, and again, that starts to debunk some of the myths that this is too expensive, particularly when you look at life cycle costing. The other dimension of this is the supply chain. How are we going to get supply chains that deliver resilience? We've been working with the UN for the past 2 years, and a report was published in Quebec in May, which sets out the challenges. The UN Environment Programme, through its 10-year framework, is going to implement this process, and it will start to spread worldwide over the next 10 years. But one of the fundamental issues we have, if you look at families of materials coming into cities to create the infrastructure and the buildings that we live in, this is a heat map. It's quite controversial. It's work that was done by the Carol Rue Institute for Technology. It's early days, but you'll see an awful lot of red. Red means unsustainable. The families of materials in black down the side are the most commonly used materials in the built environment. There's an awful lot of red in that chart. All of those are unsustainable at some point in their cycle, whether it be to do with energy or carbon, as Keith said, or water or waste. So we have a fundamental issue that if the supply chain doesn't redesign itself and become sustainable, we will have trouble creating the sort of infrastructure we need. The human aspects. How do we bring people back into the centre of the equation? Again, the World GBC and the UK GBC are working jointly on a piece of work to look at the impact of high-performing buildings and infrastructure on us, the voter, because it needs public policy, it needs a lot of support, long-term, like a 50-year plan for a city of this size. Again, there's research out there. This is an example from a piece of work that was published last year. The detailed report will be published later on this year. It will again start to provide metrics for the first time to compare, to see what the human impact is on infrastructure and buildings that are defined as sustainable or not, and therefore leading to more resilient types of communities and cities. What do we want? We all want healthier communities, we want happier communities, and we want productive communities. Now, an example, and then I'll stop. Living buildings. The Living Building Challenge is a concept that's come out of the Pacific Northwest of the US and British Columbia. You can read it here for yourself. It's pretty radical. Buildings are starting to be built that can deliver this. This is an example. It's a small project that we were lucky enough to get involved in the city of Seattle. And remember, Seattle is higher on the resilience scale than London. And it's not surprising. I mean, it's a city that's just voted through a doubling of the minimum wage for the employees. So they get the point about wealth. And you can't just concentrate it in the 1%, which is the classic American model. If you're a barista now in a coffee shop, you're going to get $10 or $11 an hour. City ordinance. This is a school in Seattle, because they get it too. And this is a living building. And it's only the 4th living building in the world, as defined by that particular model. What it's led to is a different way of thinking in the city. This is a building called Stone 34. It will become the new head office for Brooks running shoes. Now, anybody who's into running will know who Brooks are. Their chief executive saw the school, which is only 125 square meters, the classroom, and got excited and said, I want a head office that'll do this. Jim Weber gets what he wants. So he's getting this. And it's become a deep green pilot for the city of Seattle. And if you remember our color palette at the start, we've got 7 KPIs which define when you get to deep green and define where you are when you are future-proofed. The interesting thing about this is that Brooks is owned by Warren Buffett. And as Warren Buffett says, one of the most famous investors in the world, his preferred length of time to hold an investment is forever. He gets it. And this is an example of it being turned to reality. Thank you.
Well, Noel, thank you so much. Really fascinating stuff, and I bet we have some questions about some of those slides. Very interesting indeed. David Glover is going to talk to us next, CEO of Global Building Engineering at AECOM. He's a global head of building engineering, structural engineer by training, considers himself a building designer as well. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity here. In thinking about this talk, it was quite interesting. You start going back and realize how long this debate has been going on. And I think here the question was about challenge the resilience, challenge the future-proofing of London. So I kind of looked at the panel and kind of realized we were going to hit infrastructure, we were going to hit smart grids, we were going to hit some of that stuff. But I found a kind of interesting piece of work that when I looked at, I realized that we haven't, as an industry, moved forward. So when we talk about designers and constructors, planners, owners, operators, there seemed to be a screaming flaw in where we were going. Because this is about resilience and diversification. It's actually about densification as well, and the fact that we now pay an unbelievable amount to provide infrastructure to a city. So the real question comes is, how much more can we provide for the same? And the real question, the challenge for us is, do we have the technology and the will to actually start building buildings, first of all, that are energy efficient? But the piece that I would rather focus on is, The question of churn, of refurb, and how that works, because I think we are missing a point. I mean, I looked at a piece of work we actually did with Skanska 4 or 5 years ago, where we looked at actually what you could do to bring the energy usage and the resource usage down in the building, because we can have that infrastructure. I agree with Keith, this is about infrastructure, I think, but at the end of that sits a building. And actually what we've determined is that it's the user of those buildings, and actually our inability as an industry to make the right economic case to build, if you want, green or sustainable. And I think there's a challenge for us here is to look at those buildings, because the technology is there. We already have LED lights that can take 10% of the resource out of a building. We already have control systems that can deliver 15% reductions. We already have energy equipment and low energy HVAC elements which can drive another 10% out. Yes, we can also look at facades, but actually we're not picking off the easy wood. And by definition, I think there's a very simple 40-50% of a reduction in a building, in our current building stock, what we can do. I was once taken by an international banking firm who looked at churn and realized that they actually spend, as we all known for the last 15 years, we spend more money on our buildings in operating than we do on the capital cost. But our industry is still focused on capital cost. And they introduced a churn principle that actually went around, churn should be self-funding. And they made it self-funding. They looked for improvements in 20% of productivity in the social, economical performance of a building. We have to realize that every building we put up at the moment, most of the key bits that go in that, forget the structure's there, it's not going to go. The facade, you may be able to change it. But the services systems, they're all designed for replacement every 15 years. So we have a natural churn of 15 years. If we just adopted that in the city, in this London city and anywhere in the world, we could actually make that churn work, because actually it would be self-funding, self-paying, and we would actually get higher density, higher use out of the buildings we're doing. So, from my point of view, I think the challenge to us as designers, contractors, and I'm going to add owners and the CEOs who actually pay the yearly bills, to find the economic equation that allows us to take this bite. And I don't think the bite is one big thing. I think one thing we failed 4 years ago was we were always looking at refurbing whole buildings and not taking it on a piecemeal piece. It doesn't take long to replace. You know when you've got to replace the services, you know when you can do the new control systems, you know when you can provide better working arrangements. So I think the challenge for us is actually as an industry, we need to join ourselves up much closer and find the right economic model to actually say, how do we tackle the 80% of the existing stock and the money we spend? I tried to find a figure last night from someone on actually how much do we spend on fit out and churn. Everybody kind of agreed that actually it represents a massive amount of our construction budget, much more than the new buildings. I don't think new buildings are a problem at the moment. If we're going to make this future-proofing, stop our buildings becoming obsolete, because that's where we won't be adaptable, because if we have obsolete building stock, people will make the choice about the building they want to work in. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, and I think I can already hear the debate starting between is it new buildings, is it churn, and where does the architect come in, which brings me to Ken Shuttleworth, our final speaker of this session. Of course, award-winning architect, started his career at Foster and Partners, since then has been involved in Millennium Bridge, Gherkin, City Hall, you name it. We're very honoured to have him. Please welcome Ken Shuttleworth.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for Base London for inviting me today. I'm actually honoured to be with such a distinguished panel, fantastic panel. And I guess I'm here to cover the design angle, and the title of my talk was Design and the Livable City. The problem with future-proofing is knowing what future you're proofing against. I'm old enough to remember experts predicting the exhaustion of fossil fuels in the 80s. That's in the 1980s. I remember they also thought the main problem we'd have in the 21st century would be how we manage to use up our excess leisure time, whatever happened to that. We know from experience that prediction is a bit hit and miss. As a statistician, Nat Silverman so famously exposed, most expert predictions of the last 50 years would be outperformed by dart-throwing monkeys. So how do we approach risk and resilience when all you have to go on is the now? I don't want to go all Donald Rumsfeld on you, but it's useful to differentiate between those known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. As Keith has pointed out, we know we have to design carbon out of the equation, conserve energy, reduce waste, and allow for extreme weather events. We don't know exactly how climate change will affect us. We just know that it really will. Cities are complex entities whose technical, social, and physical systems interact as a single ecosystem. Anything can happen. Cities provide a platform for experiments, say in governance. The mayor of Bogota raised millions by a voluntary 10% tax to make the city safer. His equivalent in Oklahoma fronted a campaign that transformed his city's waistline. And even Boris here has his bikes. So predictions that just extrapolate from the present technological trends, can never fully accommodate the possibilities of culture and political change. This can be seismic and sudden, especially in this digital age of instant feedback. And although we recognize the political and economical, unstoppable ghettoization of rich and poor and increasingly polarized capital, we have actually little idea of how it will actually play out. Is it sustainable for the richest to live almost a generation longer than the poorest? If not, what needs to happen? There are loads of known unknowns, and much of the same is true of the world of work, or the way that digital media is transforming the way people interact. Like the old FM radio stations in the United States in the 1980s and 90s, we end up listening to what we think we like and never open our ears or our eyes to other things. We stop exploring and discovering, and there's no need to do so, and we fail to take any risk. Excitement is lost, and the safe average wins. The thing is, everything that gets built in the city reflects an ethos. Architecture always expresses a hope or a fear, an argument for an idea or resistance to another. So as architects and designers aspiring to create long-term value, our future-proofing can only be based on what those ideas are. You have to start by agreeing what the city's for. Cities are centres for innovation and freedom, havens of tolerance and sophistication. And they provide information, association, and choice. And security. Historically, the city's raison d'etre was to defend and protect its citizens. But when you look at London, the legacy city par excellence, how many of these functions are actually planned in terms of their future application? Or have they evolved through the vigor that the built environment has facilitated? The essence of any city comes from the combination of its fabric, the spaces, and the buildings, its geography, and its people. Space is soft and subject to change, and should be flexible. A city's identity and purpose is as important as the fabric of the buildings and the spaces. Should it face out to a world at large or inward to the rest of the country? So its cosmopolitan nature, a threat to self-sufficiency and our native culture or a necessary condition of progress. What should London's identity be? Do we want to make it the best place on earth to bring up children? The best place to grow old, which in my case would be great? The world's most prosperous city, or the healthiest, or the most peaceful? We know that London's identity is based on its economic and political importance and its cultural diversity. We know that with people being connected virtually and the evolution of traditional working office practices, third space and public spaces are acquiring new roles as meeting places of choice. As we know that such factors have to be accommodated by the spaces and buildings we create, their typology, their flexibility and their floor plates, and the adaptability of them in terms of design. But beyond that, I don't believe in any hard-nosed, top-down approach to urban construction. With accurate prediction of the future, we as architects can't make any meaningful diktats in isolation, and question whether it's our job to do that anyway. London, like any city, is a communal endeavour, and as such, we have to widen public engagement with its future direction. Listen, to share, and to discover. So, to help create resilience and long-term value for the future, we have to support London's evolution and nurture the public space as the glue between the city and its citizens to ensure that, above all, London is a livable city. Thank you.
Well, my thanks to all four panellists for very interesting and inspiring talks. We're going to open the floor up to questions now. So if anybody wants to ask a question to either the entire panel, the gentleman there, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Jorge Gomez from Lee Fisher. My question to the panel is, what role does London have to play on setting an example for other cities in growing economies, or the major cities, such as cities in India, Latin America, China? It is likely that London will be dependent on this type of cities for the supply chain which we have addressed. Not only that, what is the role that London will play in the future global economy? What are the dwellers and workers of London going to be doing?
Well, I mean, the C40 initiative, and there's quite a lot of city-to-city exchange of knowledge now. And particularly in the States, city-level governance is dealing with climate change because it is a real threat to them. It's a real threat to their economic and political stability. And there's nothing like a threat to make you do something. And in some cases, it's a moral leadership as well. I mean, let's be clear as a backdrop, if you don't adapt to climate change, forget about mitigation, I assume everyone knows the difference, which isn't always true of politicians. If you don't adapt to climate change, you will have social unrest. You will have a more unequal society. Even adaptation actually leads you, without some mitigation of that, to a more unequal, uninclusive society. So we've got a lot of social issues to deal with, even in keeping to around 2 degrees. And that's about economic health, social stability, a vibrant economy, and all the things that go with that. So I think there is a role for major cities to show leadership because they have the ability and institutional strength of academic institutions, things like the Institute of Civil Engineers, things like major companies headquartered here, things like having a leadership of a mayor, which happened in New York, who had a big green agenda under Bloomberg. Livingston and now Boris Johnson have that view that it is essential. Manchester's got it. That is something where leadership and industry and society through LEPs in the UK have a role. How exportable it is to different cultures is really quite a question. because the governance systems as you go through China in cities is very, very different, as it is in India, as it is in the Middle East. So I don't think there's a cookie-cutter approach. But on your second point, which relates to that, is a great thing about competition. And if my city is seen to be losing, and the scorecard is about some green agenda, most people don't know quite what that scorecard is, but it doesn't matter. They're losing. And the great thing about city ego, mayor's egos, our egos, corporate egos, is we like to compete, often meaninglessly, but we like to compete. And the peer pressure to do better than the other city is amazing. And that could be our saving grace, actually, together with the cooperation that you get. The role of the UK in the global economy? Who knows?
Noel, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, that report I mentioned earlier on the 50 cities, the top 10 were mostly in North America.
Yeah.
So again, I reinforce what Keith said. We might think about America internationally in terms of negative things, but when you go down to city level, there are things going on at least as good as anything in Scandinavia. Yeah. And quite radical in some places as well. I think the opportunity for London is still the leading financial centre in the world, and what we see is, where are the pensions in the world? The pensions in the world are in the developed economies. They're in cities like London. They're in economies like the UK. And a lot of that pension money is going into property. And it's long-term investment. It's not the fickle guy down in the stock market with his fast trading. These are investors that are in for the long term. And when you start to develop these sorts of infrastructures and assets, it's Canadian pension funds that want them. It's German pension funds that want them. It's British pension funds that want them. If you can't deliver those in the developing economies, and most of the lowest 20 on that 50 list are megacities in poor parts of the world or developing economies, there will be a problem. You either have to own that infrastructure yourself because nobody else will buy it from you, or you have to finance it. So I think that will start to differentiate. And even in a country like Sweden, we've really only got 3 cities in Sweden, and they compete like hell to be green for inward investment. And that in itself creates further and further benchmarks within the Swedish economy. The Norwegians across the border, the 20 largest cities in Norway have a strategy to outcompete Sweden. And that's where we'll see the opportunity. The talent will go there. We see talent moving from Silicon Valley to Seattle. That's why we build in Seattle and not in San Francisco. Because they don't want the expense, they don't want the cramped lifestyle and the lousy commuting that comes with living in Silicon Valley. They want to hang out in Seattle.
Very interesting. Ken, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, I mean, I think the biggest threat to everybody here is climate change. And Keith's talked about it. I mean, it's a massive, massive threat that we just, we ignore at our peril. And I think to get a livable city, you've got to take that into account. We cannot afford London to flood. If it floods once, everybody will leave. We can't afford an aeroplane to come down in West London. There's lots of things we can't actually allow to happen to make this a livable city. Otherwise, people will actually just move out and go somewhere else and take their business elsewhere. And the pollution as well. If you go to Beijing and places like that, we have people who don't want to live in Beijing because it's too polluted. They want to come back to London. So we have to keep all of those things, the environmental things, right at the top of our agenda in London to keep it livable, so people actually want to come here and don't want to go anywhere else. And I think that climate change issue just cannot be underestimated, just how massive a problem it is to the resilience of London. We're on a river, close to the sea, we've got a Thames barrier that's 30 years out of date, et cetera, et cetera. And there's still water coming down the Thames we saw last year that floods half of the west of London to sort of protect London from being flooded. And I think the whole of that debate needs to be brought right to the top of the agenda. And I think the green agenda, as Keith said, whatever you call that, is just fundamental to a livable place to be.
Your pictures that were going on throughout your presentation of the Armageddon of a flooded London, so it certainly told that story. They were very chilling. Any other questions for our panel? In fact, I wanted to ask a question. Noel, I was very struck by your chart of the supply chain with the red and how alarming that was. But what's the answer to that problem?
It was only published in May as part of a major UN Environment Programme study that's been going on to look at how we accelerate greening of the supply chain into the built environment. And there was a debate whether that actually got published or not because it is so controversial. It's not designed to set up a debate about is steel better than concrete and timber the best of all. It's more about within families of materials. But if you look at it at a macro level, and this work was done by 2 leading German institutes, then it's quite clear that at a global level, there's still a huge amount of unsustainability in the supply chain. Forget about how you manage the supply chain, but just what's coming through it. Some industries get this and are starting to mobilize globally. The cement industry probably started first back in the late 1990s. The steel industry has done a lot of work. The aluminium has done a lot of work. The timber industry has. But there's a fundamental issue in that if you come into the industry where we sit, where we have to take all these things and build something for an architect or work with an engineer, we can't tell what's good and what's bad. You know, do we believe the timber story or do we believe the concrete story? So there's a lack of transparency of what's coming through those different industries, and that's going to have to change.
I've been struck that politicians and government has barely been mentioned in this session for obvious reasons, but of course, you know, a lot of the issues we've been discussing today necessarily need government support for massive infrastructure, you know, whether it's the Davis Commission kicking the new airport into the long grass or whatever it might be. But there's always that tension with politicians that party politics will get involved, and that's very damaging to planning of a city particularly. I mean, are there any politicians that do it better than ours or that you've come across that you think really do grasp this issue? To anybody?
I think your premise is entirely wrong, actually. We live in a democracy in most places of some form, and the politicians are the people we elect. They are the people doing the planning policy for us. So the idea that private sector does great infrastructure has never, ever been true. Okay, the railways in the UK were regulated by the Victorians, who were kind of laissez-faire in their basic philosophy, and subsidised by the City of London. And the same was true of the American railways, was subsidised by the president. So the role of government in infrastructure is fundamental in a good way. The fact that they sometimes don't want to make some decisions, which we said yesterday in front of a Donaldson Heseltine, and both came out fervently to say, get on and make decisions. They are intrinsic to a healthy city and a healthy society. Because in the end, all infrastructure is paid for by 2 things and nothing else. User charge or some form of tax. There is nothing else that pays for it. The Chinese do not pay for our infrastructure. They invest in it and we pay them back. Pension funds do not give us infrastructure. They invest in it and we pay them back. And it doesn't matter whether it's a property uplift, doesn't matter if it's rateable value, doesn't matter what the tax is, or user tax from General's Fund or petrol tax, it's a tax or a fare box. They're the only sources. And that's a government decision. Only the government can make the decision about where you put that split. And that's a creative discussion. Now, if you overlay that, a very basic design parameter which is just emerging, which is CO2e, which is a much more meaningful discussion than let's be sustainable and nice. It's not about being nice, it's about making the market more perfect. That's what putting CO2e is. It's not paying for the health effects of my child having asthma because we actually subsidize petrol-driven cars. It's a different game. So I think government isn't perfect, but then nor is private sector. We need good government and good leadership, but people, it would be quite nice if all politicians did a course in the science of climate change, as opposed to the morality of sustainability, and you can argue about the morality of that. It's a science issue, you know? It's not garlic and crosses, this is science, yeah?
But how can we get that governmental decision-making process improved?
I mean, we see it all with the mayors are key to this, and cities are key. I completely agree. National politics, international politics is gridlocked for all sorts of reasons. But mayors are close to the heat, feet to the fire. They can do all sorts of things if they have fire in their belly. And we encourage that. And I think there's a role for the private sector. That example from Stockholm, there were 3 Swedish companies got together, very similar to the sort of companies on the stage here, came up with a vision document for 2070 for Stockholm, went to the city, those people who currently run the city, and Sweden tends to get run through consensus-based coalitions, much more complicated ones than the UK. And there were 2 things presented. There was a vision, but also how it was going to get paid for. If you go to a politician and say, I have a vision and I've got somebody who's going to pay for it, they'll listen. And that's why you're doubling up rail transport with highway infrastructure, a tunnel that carries trains and cars effectively, cars paying for the trains, public sector for free. That's the pitch. What politician won't go for that?
I think there was a gentleman at the front here who'd like a question.
Yeah.
Urbed, the issue of who pays for infrastructure, I think you suggested a bit simplistic in saying it's user charges or taxes. There's also the question of land value uplift and capturing the land values that increase over time as a result of improved infrastructure. In Copenhagen, the new metro was funded out of the development of Ørestad, the new town, and also a major shopping center which had to be built when they didn't get as much money as they thought. I wonder why we don't look at tapping land values in various ways. For example, by taking over land which is close to a new infrastructure like Crossrail, and then through some form of development cooperation, and then selling it off as service sites. Could you explore the obstacles to that, please?
Hong Kong's done it. Now, I'm just going to challenge you. First of all, those uplifts are taxes.
Yeah.
Okay? They are a tax. No matter how you get it, you've created land and you've captured land value and the premium which infrastructure does deliver, did on the metro lines, okay, in London, does deliver a premium. But to capture it, you have to put some form of taxation in. And if you're going to put that taxation in every station for Crossrail, the site next door doesn't have that taxation. And the site outside of that doesn't either. So the break-even point is different. Or you do what Times Square did in New York for redevelopment of Times Square, which is you say instead of an FAR of 12, you get FAR of 22. And I've sold property development. That's what I've done, which funds it. If you go to the Hong Kong model, and the same actually in Copenhagen, it did not pay for the metro. What it did was pay back for the metro. The government, in all cases, funded it. In Hong Kong, the MTRC, if you look at the accounts, is a property company which has a metro system. So they built, and I've done the construction for them. We used to run the biggest construction company in Hong Kong. We used to build the decks. The money which they then made out of selling the property rights on those decks did not fund that subway. They funded the next subway. Right? So it's a very different, so government is still there writing the check and the guarantee. And by the way, how many times has Battersea Power Station been announced as a development that's going to fund infrastructure? And how many times in the last 30 years has the developer, 40 years, gone bankrupt? This one probably won't. But if you were waiting for the Northern Line extension on the basis some guy had a great plan for Battersea, well, maybe we're there now. But that's not the way you build a vibrant city, is waiting on the market to do it. Canary Wharf, and I did the negotiation, funded 400 million in real money, 140 million for the Jubilee line. We were the only funder. The only funder. And not often you get 8 million square feet of development to do it. So in the end, it is a tax, or you're selling property rights, which the city's taken.
That Stockholm plan is the same. They get free public transport, a new East Link that's missing for cars, and a whole new suburb to the city. Seattle does it, very simple. If you come forward with development plans in the city of Seattle, and they are of a high specification that can't be fiddled, they accelerate the planning process and they give you more development space. Cities in Norway do the same. You're incentivized, and if a developer comes along with a plan that's better than the code for the city, and you're incentivized, that's manna from heaven. That's why these things get done. So it's there. We need to find ways to translate that into a London context.
But I think there's an important point here, because they are all taxes, and you've said it earlier on, those people who pay the taxes elect. And I think what we're seeing now, and I think we've seen it now in the last 5 years, which is why 12 of the American cities are up the top of that list, is that the people are now making the choice. We have instigated the cultural change now, that people actually say, I need more infrastructure, I need mass transport, which is not a car. In some places of the Western world, we can't change that. We're stuck with a car. Someone's going to have to solve the carbon of car. Whereas what we do have is, we have Hong Kong model. We still look at China, and look at China now developing cities on 80%, or sorry, it's not 80%, I think it's 60% of the carbon footprint of Western cities. So those new cities, and in India, yes, they're struggling at the moment, but in India, they're almost screaming, we do not want Western buildings, Western infrastructure. We actually want something that's a little bit easier for us to do. And I think so there is a choice here, and it's about cultural change, and I think we miss that, and I think it's taken a long time to set in, but it's there now, which is why we're getting mayors elected, why we are prepared to pay taxes for our children, for our forebearers, and a long-term view.
Although, of course, not all mayors are created equal. We saw a slide earlier today showing, how much money Boris has to spend on infrastructure compared to some other mayors, and it was very small. I think we've got one last question there.
Thank you. Martin Gibson from Temple Group. I was struck by Noel's comment about the low adaptivity of London, the low adaptive capacity. It's an old city. It's adapted a lot in the past. What's limiting its future adaptive capacity, and is there anything we can do about it?
I suggest you read the Grosvenor report, because it's their work, and that's not being rude. But we're interested, because we do business here and obviously in Stockholm as well, to look at what's different. I guess one of the big things is we're in a higher tax system in Sweden than here. We're in a state that looks after you from cradle to grave. We're in a nation where consensus drives all key decisions. Do those conditions exist here? And do they exist to the same extent? Finland's even more dramatic. I don't know if you're familiar with something called One Planet Living. Yeah, okay. We're heavily involved with a number of Finnish municipalities who are planning to redesign all of their municipality on the basis of what's going on in Sutton. Now, you look at any set of indicators in the world in terms of the human situation. Finland, best for education, best for looking after old people, best for looking after kids. Again, it's a consensus-based, and it's a high-tax situation. This doesn't come for free. Basically, that's the message. It's whether those people who have the money today have enough of it, and I missed that bit of the presentation, and are they spending it in a way which maximizes the return for the totality of that society? And that's a question for London and for the population of London.
And I think that's the question on which we will chew over lunch now. I want to thank this panel very much. I think that was a really interesting, engaging session.